Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to the fourth week in a six-week series entitled Conflict, Hostility, or Harmony. For you viewers who are with us the first 3 weeks, you know that we have dealt with this issue as related to the problems of crime, the family, and education. It's our privilege to discuss today the area of religion, or the institution of religion, and we could not have a better qualified guest today to speak to this issue. I welcome to the program Dr. John K. Roth. Dr. Roth is a professor in the departments of religion and philosophy at Claremont McKinney College in Claremont, California. He has received numerous distinctions for his work. Among those, in 1988, he was named Professor of the Year in Canada and the United States by the Carnegie Endowment for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Dr. Roth is an expert in American studies in the field of religion and philosophy and the Holocaust and the problems that it relates to the whole issue of religion. I do not know how he could do so much to be such a young man. In addition to all of that, he's published 16 books and over 150 articles. He is also interested in many other issues, and he's been on our campus during this symposium week to discuss conflict. Dr. Roth, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I'm very happy to have two panel members today to join me in questioning our guests on this very, very important topic. First of all, regular panelist Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is visiting panel member David Lindsay, who is the Dean of Students at North Idaho College, and it's Mr. Lindsay's first time to be with us, and we're happy to have you with us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Tony.
I will ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Dr. Roth, to set the stage for our viewers, can we talk a little bit about the historical conflict that has occurred in the field of religion? What are some of the historical perspectives on this conflict?
I began my remarks earlier today with a biblical story which is found in Genesis early on in the account about the creation of the world, and it involved the relations between two brothers, Cain and Abel. And one of the brothers killed the other one over a conflict that had to do with who had the greater favor with God. So that I think this story, which is a kind of archetypal image and experience that is deep-seated in human history and in the human psyche, suggests that conflict has been in religion almost from the beginning in one way or another, and yet we hope that religion in some ways can also be the means for the resolution of conflict. And I think that's what we've been trying to explore in the symposium today.
David Lindsay.
If you mentioned that religion becomes the means for resolution of that conflict, that intrigues me. Is that there's as a thin line of where that becomes the means for the resolution, or perhaps a crutch for certain people to use to reach their resolution in conflict. Could you
well,
talk about that?
I think the sources for conflict resolution that are found in religion include things like the following. Nearly all religions, in fact I would be bold enough to say all of them that I know of, speak about the importance of justice. They have provisions in them for forgiveness. They accent love. They accent attempts to try to achieve greater harmony among human beings. Now, all of these things are resting on the awareness that there is conflict and disagreement, and even violence and murder, as the story of Cain and Abel suggests to us, so that it's resting on the sense of a need for the resolution and healing of wounds. And I think that religion at its best succeeds in helping people to cope with conflict and to live through it in a way that can promote healing. But the difficulties that exist also are there because religions tend to have, and this is a kind of paradox about them, they tend to preach views of inclusiveness, but at the same time they have built into them elements of exclusivity and even of intolerance. So religions are a mixed bag. They are things which can help us to get along, but they are also very often the things that pit people against one another.
Dr. Roth, I want to pursue this whole issue from the historical perspective, which you did a brilliant job with our audience today in helping us understand that background. And I come from the school that one needs a historical perspective to understand today.
Mm-hmm.
You indicated, and I want to give you some time on this program to elaborate upon that, that if we go back to the history of the early Jewish history and the rise of Christianity, that some very, very important things happened with two religious centers. And I wished you would take some time to explain what happened that has caused us to have a lot of misunderstanding, and you even use terms like, in religion, turning to hate rather than to love.
Yes. Well, it's a long and complex story, but one filled with drama and intensity and yearning, I think. But let's try in a nutshell to get at it. I'm particularly interested in the relationships that have existed historically and also in contemporary life between Jews and Christians. And what we know is that Christianity is a religious tradition that emerged out of Jewish life. But the emergence of it involved some serious conflict, and the conflict is particularly potent because it has the texture of what is sometimes referred to as a sibling rivalry. We all know sometimes that the worst kinds of quarrels and difficulties can be between members of the same family. Those can become, in a sense, the most inflammatory and volatile. Christianity emerged out of Judaism because there were a group of Jews who followed a man from Nazareth whose name was Jesus. They became convinced that as a teacher, he had particular insights that were important, that were in the spectrum of Judaism as it existed at the time. There was nothing that would have led to a break at that point, although Jesus had some different views than maybe other Jews might have had about their own tradition. But the crucial thing that happened here was that Jesus was put to death by Roman power, I like to stress. But his followers became convinced that his death was not the last thing that had happened, that in fact he had been resurrected from death, and that this signified to the followers of Jesus that Jesus was the Messiah whom the Jewish people had expected. But this led to a fundamental point of conflict, because the group of followers of Jesus who interpreted him as the Messiah, the risen Christ as he became known, they were a minority, and they were not particularly welcomed or embraced by the mainstream in the Jewish tradition. But this group of followers persisted in its belief, and eventually what happened was that since they weren't having much success in convincing other Jews about the views that they held, they turned to what we call the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world. And Christianity slowly began to spread. But a critical issue that existed was, how do you explain or how do you account for the fact that the founder now of this new religious movement, which came to be called Christianity, was put to death? And you have to give an account of who is responsible for the death of this person. Early Christians, we know, were persecuted in the Roman Empire. So they were not particularly going to be likely to say the Romans are the ones who killed our leader and put themselves in the position of being regarded as anti-Roman folks. So instead what they did was to place the blame, as it were, on the Jews who had failed somehow to see the light and follow along in terms of being disciples of Jesus. That led then, as it unfolded, into what eventually came to be known as a teaching of contempt, the notion that Christians looked upon Jews as Christ killers, as being people who were outside the pale, in a sense, who had once had a special relationship with God, but who had lost it because they had taken a way that was, in the final analysis, deicidal. It rejected God so utterly that it involved the killing of God's Son. So vilification, name-calling, animosity, conflict, hatred, violence, that spiral began to unfold. And unfortunately, it is, I think, part of what became the road that eventually led to the Holocaust and to Auschwitz. Not that Christianity caused the Holocaust, but I think that the Christian conflict with Judaism and the hatred that spawned was one of the conditions that made it possible later for Nazism to enact the final solution. So the historical record here is filled with elements of real darkness and tragedy that were based on difference of opinion about things that the two groups took to be non-negotiable. Obviously, both religious traditions have a much happier side to them. They both have, I think, tremendous resources for bridging conflict and for helping people to move beyond it. Unfortunately, they haven't always used those resources to deal with the conflicts that exist between the two traditions themselves.
I have a follow-up question before I return to the panel, and it has to do with just what you're addressing. You have been very clear today in indicating that with organized religion, where we're talking about Christianity or Judaism, whatever it is, that you've talked about it from the terms that it's best and it's worst, and with the covenants. Would you take a moment with our audience to show how religion is so helpful in the lives of people, but there's the other side that it can become very dangerous if it's used wrongly within the political process, as you talked about, if hate is involved, and it can lead outside of religion into politics and persecution.
Sure. I learned the principle of the importance of looking at religion not only in terms of the worst that it has to offer, but also in terms of the best that it can provide by studying the works of an American philosopher named William James, who at the turn of the century wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is a classic of a kind of psychological study of religious experience. And he stressed, as he looked at the vast range and variety that religious life can have, that there was a lot of, well, frankly, craziness that was present in it, strange and bizarre elements, and some that he didn't find particularly helpful for human health in the broadest sense. But he found that as he studied it, that there was much that religion had to offer, and so he articulated the importance of looking at religion at its best. Now, at its best, what I think religion does is to talk about things that I alluded to earlier. It talks about justice, forgiveness, healing, reconciliation, forgiveness, the sense that all human beings fall short of the mark, that we are all less than perfect, that we are all creatures, not absolute and not divine. So that I think what religion at its best can do is to make us aware, sensitize us to the fact that we are all human beings who share very much in common, in spite of, and in some ways because of, our differences. And religion at its best, I think, has the capacity to help foster that kind of respect for one another. But the danger, to go back again to what I was alluding to earlier, is that that religions are particular. They don't all see the world in the same way. They come out of different experiences, different needs, different cultures, different historical realities. And yet they are all trying to talk about ultimate things, fundamental things. So the differences that exist here can be emotionally charged. They can be potent, powerful images and ideas that are present. And sometimes those then can have the power of being deeply at odds with one another. And when looked at in that way, the conflict is serious, because if you believe that your view is right about ultimate things like death and goodness and evil and qualities of that kind, and somebody else thinks differently about those things than you do, that's quite naturally going to be serious business. And when religions are too serious about that, when they do what I would call absolutize the relative, then I think we get into the difficulty of conflict that can even lead to bloodshed.
Thank you.
You
Jim
talk.
Alberg.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Something that we maybe should have done earlier in the show is define that term religion that you're using. We've sort of bandied, you've talked about a lot of things, and I
Yes.
think we're talking about a lot of things under that umbrella. How do you define religion? What do you mean by it?
Religion is by itself a hard term to define, because it covers so many things. I think if we just look at our own American culture in terms of this category that William James coined, the varieties of religious experience, we have everything in our own society from the major religious traditions of Judaism and Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and those kinds of things, but a whole proliferation of what we sometimes today speak of as new religions, things that have emerged much more recently that have different textures and different qualities about them. And if you're looking for, a brief definition that can cover all of these things, I think sometimes it becomes so general that it doesn't say very much. But in spite of that, I would say that what religion talks about is the fundamental things about our lives. Where does our life come from? Does it have some kind of an ultimate destiny and purpose about it? What are we supposed to do with our lives? How are we to relate to other people? What sorts of practices are ones that we are to pursue and also to avoid? I think that all religions have teachings about those qualities. Having said that, that's kind of a formal way of defining it. When you get into the content that fills in the form, then you get the variety, and then you get the potential for the conflict that we've been talking about. But I also happen to believe that it's out of the particularity of religious experiences and traditions that the occasions for conflict resolution can arise too. That is, people are not just, I think, religious in some generic fashion, or even non-religious in some generic fashion. We relate and respond to a more particular concrete reality than that. The liability is that this can be too narrow, but the advantage is that religion then touches our lives in the way we actually live, and the teachings of it can help us to relate to other people.
So let's talk about some of those success stories. What are some of those points of success that have occurred throughout history when religion has had a very positive effect on people?
Well, I think the most dramatic one that we could point to in our own American experience would probably come out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The energy that came from Martin Luther King Jr. and from others who pushed hard on that score was I believe, in a fundamental way, religious in character. Now, what happened here was that, in this case, religion for a time had a role in intensifying conflict, because it's also true, and King himself pointed this out, that some of the strongest opposition that he encountered to the quest for civil rights that he was interested in came from churches in the United States, which had embraced a form of religious life that was contrary to the kinds of things that King hoped to achieve. So here we have it again, religion in American society producing conflict in a sense for at least a moment in history. But I think we would have to say that in the long run, the spirituality of King and his followers, insofar as that was religious, probably won the day in this society. Not perfectly, but I think we've all come a long way in American society from where we were prior to the civil rights situation in 1964-65. So I would point to that as an example of a place where I think that religion led to a kind of conflict resolution. Imperfectly, because there remains much to do in that area, but I think that there were triumphs that one would be hard-pressed to account for without taking religion into account. David Lindsay.
You spoke earlier about a society's health being reflective in its religious stance. I see the United States has had a history of being a melting pot. I see it now as being a super melting pot, and this example you brought up of Martin Luther King is reflective of that, of where religious belief might strengthen that. Yes. But I also see the other side of the dichotomy of saying it can also tear it apart. Sure. Can you address those two pulling aspects a little bit?
Well, here the example I would turn to, which comes out of my interest in the study of the Holocaust, the Nazi attempt to annihilate the Jews of Europe. I would say that the version of Christianity that came to prominence in the Third Reich represents the night side of what we're talking about here. In that instance, I think the Christian churches, for the most part, there was a dissenting minority that is very important to keep in mind too. But for the most part, I think what happened was that the Christian churches collapsed the distinction between the loyalty to their religious tradition on the one hand and their loyalty to their nation on the other. And the two became so interfused that the religion became both an expression and a legitimation of a form of nationalism, which turned out to be massively destructive. Now that, I think, is a constant temptation that exists for religion, that it will tend to link itself too closely to the powers that be. And when that happens, I think we are in a very problematic situation. At its best, I think what religion does politically is to help hold a people, a community, a nation even, to its highest ideals, insofar as those ideals are consonant or sympathetic to the highest traditions and teachings of the religion itself. So this would be, to come back now to our own society, I think when we talk about living in a society in which we want liberty and justice for all, as the Pledge of Allegiance has it, I would think that in the religious traditions in our society we have echoes of that sentiment. In fact, those religious traditions may be the source of that sentiment. And religion's function, I think, is healthy, in particular when it keeps our eyes and our attention focused on those ideals. Religion can become a measuring stick for us that's very important. And then out of that, it can sometimes, I think, lead to conflict resolution, even though there may be conflict on the way to the resolution.
How about the multi-religious society that we have here in the United States? That itself seems to breed some conflict.
Yes, it does. I think it reflects two sides which are in some tension with each other all the time, and where we have to keep evaluating what the relationship should be. On the one hand, I think rightly we celebrate the religious pluralism of our society because the presence of the diversity indicates that there is religious liberty in this society, which is certainly something that not every people on the face of the earth has enjoyed. But we have that here. At the same time, the degree of diversity that we have religiously in this society mirrors in part an ongoing feeling and perception that people have, which says earlier traditions, earlier groups got it wrong. They may have started out with good intentions, but their way of practicing a tradition or their way of pursuing religious truth went awry somewhere, it got off track, it has to be reconstituted and reformed, and now we'll have a new denomination or a new sect or a new tradition that we'll try to start. So that can be very healthy in some ways, but it also contains a little bit in it, I think, the tendency toward exclusivity and intolerance that I regard as probably the two chief sins that religion at its worst produces.
Dr. Roth, in relation to that, you, again today, you were very clear on dealing with, in a particular religion, and if we're getting into the problem area, when there are points of the dogma or there are principles that come into a collision course, that they're in disagreement, or maybe it's from certain developments that take place in the world that puts them in that position. Would you share with our viewers your position on the two ways that a religion will deal with that problem?
Well, I think sometimes religious perspectives will lead people to dig in their heels. I think we may see this happening to some degree with questions about abortion in this society, or maybe with what the content of school textbooks should be. That because people hold religious traditions, they will tend to see some views as non-negotiable. And then there's intransigence and stubbornness that set in, and that doesn't lead so much, I think, to conflict resolution as it does just to the intensification of conflict. So that I think in issues of that kind, religion probably serves us better when it opens up in some way or other the occasion for dialogue and for the open sharing of views, and even for the ability to appreciate what the other side is saying. Now, I don't know whether that automatically leads to the elimination of the problem that's present, but I think it can at least lead to a different way of looking on the differences that people hold. Because I think what often happens is that when there are differences that are rooted in religious feeling, people begin to look at each other not as men and women, but almost as, us and them, or as our side and the enemy, and then you're on a track where vilification and the mischief that can include unfolds, and that probably intensifies and worsens conflict rather than moving us beyond it.
You also suggested that sometimes when we talk about religion, and certainly at the basis of the discussion, there's no term used more often than love for humanity. But I was very impressed today, and I'd like you to share with the viewers that you suggest that sometimes that is misused and misinterpreted, and you suggest a redefinition sometimes of love. Would you share your view?
Yes, I was drawing on some of the thought by a man named Christer Stendahl, who is a Swede who's been a leader in 20th century Christianity and served as a long time as dean, I believe, of the Divinity School at Harvard University. He said something which caught my attention very much. He said that he was afraid and suspicious of the word love as it is used so frequently in religious language and in Christian tradition in particular. And the reason he said that he was suspicious and fearful of it was that he thought that so much harm had been done in the name of love. And I think if we think back to the history of religions, we can see that. You have to die so because I love you and want to save your soul or something like that, even though you're not willing to agree with what I say, but I love you even though I'm going to have to kill you in the process. So he wanted to back away from that and suggest that maybe instead of talking so much about love, we ought to talk about what he called esteem. And then he went on to explain what he meant by that term. And he had a very interesting point to make. He said that if you esteem another person, this may be reflected in and resting upon the view that the other person really has something to offer to me, something I can benefit from.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're out of time. I wish we could go on. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Roth, and the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program. I wish we could continue for another hour, but we cannot. I hope you'll be with us next week when we continue this series. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.